Today on the Ministry of Guitar, we break down what's really going on with the guitar market using data. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Ministry of Guitar. I'm Utkarsh. There's always talk on the guitar market. Some brands have gone up a lot. Guitars in general have gotten more expensive. Some guitars don't hold their value. They're a terrible investment, so on and so forth. And it's always been based on opinions. Luckily, Reverb has done a study and now we have actual data to compare. So what I have here is I have Reverb study open in front of me and we're going to form some conclusions. Well, we're going to share some of Reverb's conclusions, but I'm going to kind of parse the data a little bit more and we're going to come up with certain conclusions that help us understand what's really going on with the guitar market. The first thing to note, which I took away after I read this, is guitars in general are indeed more expensive now than they were pre-pandemic. Now, this may seem obvious because, the guitar market went up during the pandemic, but then it went down as well. But where did it all settle in? Well, it's a very simple way to determine what's true or what's not true. Reverb's conclusion is used electrics are 32% more expensive today than they were in 2019. So you may say, okay, that's obvious. So it's more expensive. But something has changed because the dollar is also worth less because of inflation, right? $1, what it could buy you in 2019 buys you less today. So if you just take a simple inflation calculator and we adjust this, add $1 today, $1 in 2019 would get you $1.26 today. So that's a 26% impact of inflation. So yes, guitars are just a touch, maybe 5-6% more expensive today. 32% more expensive, but in general, everything is 26% more expensive. And hopefully your salary is already gone up by 26%. But we know that that's a separate issue in terms of salaries not really matching inflation. But this is not a podcast or a show that discusses that. So anyways, for the average inflation adjusted dollar, guitars are just a touch more expensive. The interesting thing that I saw is that there was indeed significant volatility. So everything that we were feeling, which is that guitars went up in price dramatically and then they came down, that is true. And you see this across the board. You see this across all the major brands. The interesting conclusion over here is that PRS went up less and it came down less. Whereas the Gibsons and the Fenders went up a fair bit, but they also came down. That said, if you had a PRS guitar in 2019 versus if you had a Gibson guitar or a Fender guitar in 2019, you were better off with the Fender and the Gibson because they did go up a fair amount in the hype. The flip side of this is if you bought a Fender or a PRS or a Fender or a Gibson guitar at the top of the hype, it went down a fair bit. What do we conclude about this? This tells us a lot about the consumer. Who is the kind of person, and I know the guitar market is all very, very incestuous because the same person may be buying Fender, Gibson, PRS, look at me. But it does tell you something about the mindset. It tells you that something like Gibson or a Fender is often bought a little bit more from the heart, a little bit more from the hype. Fender and Gibson are very good at the hype. They have 50 years, 60 years, 70 years of hype because they have the hype of rock and roll behind them. Something like a PRS is a little bit more functional. Yes, you may still buy it from the heart because it looks very beautiful or so on and so forth. But this simply tells you that when the hype happened on the whole guitar industry around the pandemic, PRS simply did not go up that much. If you say compare this to what happened with Fender, look at where Fender was in 2019 Fender PR. This is basically an equalized scale. All prices are equalized to 1,000. So a Fender went from 1,000 to all the way up to 1,342. And then it went down again. Similarly for Gibson, went all the way up to 1,357, went down again. So that just tells you a little bit about how Fenders and Gibsons are bought with a little bit less of the functionality in mind, a little bit more of the emotion in mind, but PRS surprisingly seem to be a lot more unemotional, or rather a lot less, more from the head, less from the heart. So that was very interesting for me. The other interesting thing for me is that vintage guitars moved up more than used guitars. This is not surprising. Of course, the interesting thing here is that vintage guitars moved up and they moved down as well, but they still settled at a price that is higher. This goes back to the same point that we were making with PRS versus Fender Gibson. A vintage guitar, again, is not so much of an instrument. It's more of an emotional purchase, and sometimes you could say there's an eye towards investment towards a collectible market. But again, the data again confirms that when things are not necessarily done from a functional standpoint, there is more volatility, which is why they also cited that the vintage guitar market was more choppy, like I said so here. So the highs went up dramatic, but it went down as well. So again, the market is doing reasonably well. It's still much higher than where it was in 2019. So yes, if you wanted a vintage guitar, it is getting more and more. The other thing that they concluded was not very surprising. The highest gains will always come from the specialty, limited runs, unique models. So if you indeed want to take a bet on something doing really well, it would have to be something that becomes a bit of a cult classic. So you see the Hello Kitty Stratocaster, you see some of the particular signature models that do pretty well. And the other thing that always affects the guitar market is what I always tell people, it's all about supply and demand. So if you have something that's popular but there isn't supply, that is the best thing to drive its price up. Like I have that Gibson Baritone Explorers just hanging over there. If I just turn my camera, that thing, I bought it for 1200 US, and I get offers of 3000 US on it all the time. Not because there aren't other Explorer shaped baritones out there are plenty. Not because there aren't other baritone guitars out there are plenty. It's just because Gibson never made another baritone Explorer. They just made, I don't know, not even a few hundred of them back in 2011. So if you are looking at that kind of point of view, don't think something is going to do well just because it's great. It also needs to have limited supply. So that's just something to know. Then the point that I was talking about, which is kind of which is how I got to know this article. Reverb said that PRS is the quiet champion in the market for used guitars. I wouldn't really say that. I wouldn't call it a quiet champion because net Fender and Gibson have gone up more from the pre-pandemic. But what is true is that if you're buying a used PRS, the price of it will generally be stable. Right, so buying it new, of course, you have probably price declines, but when you're buying a used PRS, what you generally get is a good instrument that works and it price goes up steadily. So it's not a bad option, if you're really buying an instrument and yet you want something that can be converted to cash someday and you can be reasonably sure of how much it's worth. A used PRS is never a bad idea because it's pretty well priced used to begin with. Let's see Reverb's key takeaways. Price stability last 12 months. Yes, I would agree with this. There was a lot of high during the pandemic that it crashed down again, but it has been stable for the last 12 months. Vintage models have retained more of the pandemic era gains. That makes sense. Signature models, discounted models have risen popularity. True. PRS has seen the least price volatility. Yes, that's correct. So beyond Reverb's conclusions, what are my conclusions? My conclusions are three things. One is just from the fact that price is stable over the last 12 months, the death of the electric guitar market, because we've been talking about the slow death of guitar, YouTube, this and that, I would say the death of the electric guitar market has been exaggerated. I think the market is still healthy. I think we got used to such a boom in 2019 so we saw two booms. We saw the content boom from 2015 to 2019-ish, 20-ish, and 1920 the content boom, which is guitar content on the net, was basically was basically added on by the supply and the pandemic boom. So the whole consequence of that is that we've got used to boom times over the last 10 years, and now suddenly it isn't boom times anymore, it's regular times. So when the comparison is boom, regular seems bad, but regular is not bad, it's okay. So the guitar market is chugging along reasonably well. Number two is that I sense, looking at the data, especially looking at the price stability that you have with PRS and some other brands, is that you are seeing a gradual shift in the market from, the Fender and the Gibsons. Because typically what you would have is when you have a boom and a bust, you would see bigger busts. What typically happens is that you should have a bigger bust amongst less reputable brands. So in a typical marketing of the property market up and down, the properties that are more difficult to buy or more difficult to sell would usually go down much more when there's a bust. PRS in theory is more difficult to sell than Fender or Gibson, right? Because Fender and Gibson are the established brands, but somehow it had maintained its price stability. So you are seeing the guitar market move beyond the purely Gibson and Fender thinking, which can only be a good thing. So that's one important thing to note. And the third one, which we have always talked about, is that unique guitars, special guitars, limited supply guitars, they will always be a source of growth. So if you do indeed have some guitars in your collection that are unique, unless you really need the cash, if you know that there's a potential, future upside for it, I would suggest not selling it. So for example, I'm not selling my Baritone Explorer. I have so many other guitars that are rather unique that I know have a future, particularly if it's an artist model or a special run or offers features that other guitars don't. don't sell it unless you really need to, because they might just see good outsized gains versus the others. All right, folks, I hope this was interesting for you, and I'll see you next time.